August 25th, 1942. A flying boat climbs through thick Scottish fog, carrying 15 souls aboard. Among them sits a royal prince, making what should be a routine flight to Iceland. 37 minutes later, the aircraft slams into a remote hillside. Only one man survives. The prince dies instantly. He was just 39 years old. For more than 80 years, questions have circulated about what really happened that day. But the crash was only the final chapter in a life that had already defied every expectation of what it meant to be royal. This is the story of Prince George, Duke of Kent, the fourth son. On a cold December evening in 1902, at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate, Queen Alexandra's daughter-in-law gave birth to her fifth child. The boy, named George Edward Alexander Edmund, arrived into a world of privilege and protocol. His father was the Prince of Wales, soon to become King George V. His mother, Princess Mary of Teck, would become Queen Mary. The christening took place at the private chapel at Windsor Castle, performed by the Bishop of Oxford. It was the kind of ceremony that royal babies had endured for centuries, surrounded by godparents from Europe's most powerful families, dressed in historic gowns, blessed with water from the River Jordan. George grew up in the shadow of his older brothers. Edward, the golden child, was heir to the throne. Albert, quiet and stammering, would one day become King George VI. Henry, solid and dependable, would serve the crown without complaint. And then there was George, born fourth in line, the spare to the spare to the spare. The royal children were raised with strict discipline. Their father, who would become King George V in 1910 after the death of Edward VII, believed in routine, order, and duty above all else. Emotions were to be controlled, never displayed. Personal desires came second to royal obligation. It was a cold way to raise children, even by the standards of the era. George, from an early age, seemed to struggle with these constraints more than his siblings. Where Edward learned to charm his way through expectations, and Albert simply endured them, George chafed against them. He wanted colour in a world painted in shades of grey. But unlike his brothers, George possessed something different. He was taller than the rest of the family, standing out physically as much as he would come to stand out in every other way. He had matinee idol looks, with dark hair and striking features that would later make him the subject of society photographers and gossip columns alike. Even as a child, there was something about him that drew attention, an ease with people, a natural charm that seemed effortless. At 13, following family tradition, George was sent to Naval College at Osborne, then Dartmouth. The Royal Navy was supposed to make men of royal princes, to instill discipline and duty. For George, it became something to endure rather than embrace. Life at Naval College was harsh by design. The young princes were treated no differently than other cadets, at least officially. Cold showers in the morning, endless drills, classes in navigation and seamanship. George's older brothers had survived it. So would he. But where Edward had eventually found his footing, and Albert had gritted his way through despite his stammer, George simply went through the motions. He learned what he needed to learn, passed the examinations, followed the rules. But his heart was never in it. He was promoted to sub-lieutenant in 1924, then to full lieutenant 2 years later. He served on HMS Iron Duke, the dreadnought battleship that had seen action at the Battle of Jutland. Later, he transferred to HMS Nelson, the flagship of the Atlantic Fleet, serving as a lieutenant on the Admiral's staff. In 1928, he transferred to HMS Durban, stationed at the Royal Naval Dockyard in Bermuda. His father had served there years before, making the same rounds, keeping the same watches. Bermuda offered some relief with its warmer climate, but it was still a battleship, still the military, still a life that felt like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. During shore leave, George discovered another world entirely: the clubs of London, the parties in Paris, the glittering social scene that thrived in the 1920s. This was where he could be himself, exploring interests that had nothing to do with naval operations or royal duty. He developed a passion for the arts: music, theatre, ballet, opera. He could discuss composers and performances with genuine knowledge and enthusiasm. Interior decoration became another fascination. He had an eye for colour, for line, for how a room should feel. Fashion, too. George began paying attention to how he dressed in a way that went beyond mere propriety. He patronised the finest tailors, developed relationships with designers who understood style as an art form. He became known for his elegance, for an effortless sophistication that set him apart from his more conservative brothers. While his father collected stamps with methodical dedication, George collected experiences. He wanted to live, not just exist within the narrow confines of what it meant to be royal. And then he met Kiki Preston, the girl with the silver syringe. She had a nickname that said everything you needed to know about her. They called her the girl with the silver syringe. Alice Gwynne Preston, known as Kiki to everyone who mattered, was American aristocracy gone wild. A cousin to Gloria Vanderbilt, she moved through the high society circles of Paris and New York like a beautiful storm. Kiki was married when George met her in the mid-1920s. She was also a morphine addict and a cocaine user, and a woman who lived by her own rules in an era when such behaviour, particularly for a woman, was scandalous beyond measure. She carried her silver syringe with her everywhere. At parties, at dinners, at the finest establishments in Europe, she would produce it and inject herself right there in front of everyone. Some found it shocking, others found her fascinating. George found both. Their relationship was immediate and intense. George, still in his early 20s, fell completely under her spell. It wasn't just attraction, though that was certainly part of it. Kiki represented everything his rigid royal upbringing had denied him: freedom, wildness, a complete disregard for what others thought. She introduced him to morphine, then cocaine. The drugs became as much a part of his life as she was. In the blur of London nightclubs and Parisian apartments, George discovered a version of himself that had nothing to do with being the fourth son of the king. There were whispers, of course. Whispers about threesomes, including one with the bisexual son of the Argentine ambassador. Whispers about George's own preferences, about relationships with both men and women. In an era when such things could destroy a person's reputation completely, George seemed almost reckless in his disregard for discretion. But it was the drugs that truly alarmed the royal family. By the late 1920s, George's addiction was becoming impossible to hide. He was deteriorating before their eyes, and his family knew that Kiki Preston was at the centre of it all. His eldest brother Edward, the Prince of Wales, took action. Edward himself was hardly a model of royal propriety. He was already involved with Wallis Simpson, the American divorcee who would eventually cost him the throne. But even Edward recognized that George was spiraling toward destruction. In the summer of 1929, when Kiki came to visit George in England, Edward used his royal influence to have her removed from the country. He literally had her kicked out, banished like someone from a medieval court. Then he turned his attention to his brother. George needed to get clean, and Edward was determined to make it happen. There were no rehabilitation centres in 1929, no Betty Ford clinics, no professional addiction treatment. Instead, Edward took George to a remote country estate and essentially locked him up. What happened there was brutal. Withdrawal from morphine and cocaine is agonizing under the best circumstances. Without medical supervision, without proper support, it must have been torture. But Edward stayed with him through it, forcing his brother to endure the shakes, the sweats, the desperate craving for relief that never came. Somehow, it worked. George emerged clean, or at least cleaner, but the damage to his psyche was done. The next few years would show whether the lesson had truly taken hold. In 1932, George was holidaying in Cannes, the French Riviera resort, where the wealthy went to see and be seen. The beach was crowded with familiar faces from Europe's aristocracy. And then he saw her. Kiki Preston, 3 years after Edward had forced them apart. The connection was immediate, electric, as powerful as it had ever been. They gravitated toward each other like magnets, unable to resist despite everything that had happened. Whether George wanted her or wanted what she represented, the drugs, the freedom, the rebellion against his family's expectations, no one could say for certain. Perhaps it was all of it at once, but this time, his family was watching. Before George could fully reconnect with Kiki, before the old patterns could reassert themselves, he was physically removed from the situation. Quite literally dragged away, some accounts suggest, like a man being saved from drowning. It was a close call. Too close. The family realized that simply keeping Kiki away wasn't enough. George needed something else to focus on, a different kind of anchor. By this time, George had left the Royal Navy for good. In March 1929, the same year Edward had him rehabilitated, George walked away from military service. It must have been a relief, like finally removing shoes that had been pinching for years. He briefly took positions at the Foreign Office and the Home Office, becoming the first member of the British royal family to work as a civil servant. It was unprecedented. A royal prince actually working in government offices alongside commoners, doing regular jobs. For a brief period, George tried to find satisfaction in this new role. But the positions never quite worked out. Civil service required its own kind of conformity, its own rigid structures. George would show up, do what was required, but his heart wasn't in this either. What he really wanted was freedom to pursue his interests, to live the kind of life that felt authentic to him. His social life during this period was the subject of constant speculation. There were rumors about affairs with numerous women. Some were society figures, like Poppy Baring, whom the King and Queen deemed unsuitable as a royal bride. Others included Lois Sturt, Paula Gellibrand, Audrey Coates, and several more. George seemed to move through relationships easily, never quite settling, never quite committing. There were also whispered suggestions about relationships with men. The playwright Noel Coward, brilliant and sophisticated, was mentioned. Some spoke of Anthony Blunt, the Cambridge art historian who would later be revealed as a Soviet spy. Others mentioned various aristocrats and artists who moved in the same circles George frequented. In an era when such relationships, if acknowledged publicly, could result in criminal prosecution, George's alleged behavior was remarkably brazen. If even half the stories were true, he was taking extraordinary risks. Perhaps he felt protected by his royal status. Perhaps he simply didn't care. Or perhaps he believed that living authentically was worth any risk. His first major relationship had been with a woman named Gladys Jean Combe, daughter of a captain in the Royal Horse Guards. He'd met her during his naval service, on one of his trips ashore from HMS Mackay. That relationship, at least, had been relatively conventional, though it eventually ended. But these were half measures. What George needed, what his family decided he needed, was marriage. Not just any marriage, but one that would stabilize him, give him purpose, provide the structure that he seemed unable to create for himself: the perfect princess. She appeared at a luncheon in September 1933 at Claridge's Hotel in London. Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark was visiting with her sister Olga and Olga's husband, Prince Paul of Yugoslavia. She was 26 years old, beautiful, cultured, and sophisticated in ways that most English women of her class could never quite manage. Marina had been born into European royalty, the daughter of Prince Nicholas of Greece and Grand Duchess Elena Vladimirovna of Russia. Her bloodline connected her to the Tsars of Russia and the kings of Denmark. But by 1933, that heritage had become more of a burden than a blessing. The Russian Revolution had stripped her family of wealth and position. They lived in exile in Paris, maintaining the appearance of aristocracy while actually struggling to make ends meet. Marina had worked, quietly and discreetly, in a way that royal princesses were not supposed to work. She knew Paris intimately, knew its artistic circles, knew how to navigate a world that existed outside the rigid protocols of formal court life. George and Marina had met before. They were second cousins, both great-grandchildren of King Christian IX of Denmark. But at the Claridge's luncheon, something shifted. They paid attention to each other in a way they never had before. George's eldest brother encouraged the match. Edward could see what everyone could see. Marina was perfect. Beautiful enough to satisfy the public's desire for glamour, royal enough to satisfy the family's need for proper bloodlines, and sophisticated enough to potentially understand and accommodate George's complicated nature. The courtship moved quickly. By summer 1934, Marina's mother and other members of the Greek royal family had come to London, and George and Marina began seeing each other seriously. On the evening of August 20th, after a game of backgammon with Marina's family, George found himself alone with her. He proposed. She accepted. 8 days later, Buckingham Palace announced the engagement of Prince George, who had been created Duke of Kent in anticipation of his marriage, to Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark. The Royal Wedding. November 29th, 1934. Westminster Abbey filled with royalty from across Europe. 3 reigning monarchs, King George V, King Christian X of Denmark, and King Haakon VII of Norway, attended. Princesses and princes from Greece, Russia, Yugoslavia, and beyond crowded the pews. It was the first major royal wedding in more than 11 years since Albert, Duke of York, had married Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. The public was hungry for spectacle, for glamour, for something to celebrate during the grim years of the Depression. Marina delivered. Her wedding dress, designed by Edward Molyneux, was made of silver and white brocade that shimmered under the lights. The court train stretched 15 feet behind her. She wore a diamond-fringed tiara that had belonged to her mother, Grand Duchess Elena Vladimirovna of Russia. George wore ceremonial Royal Navy dress with the insignia of the Order of the Garter. His 2 eldest brothers, Edward and Albert, served as his supporters. 8 bridesmaids attended Marina, all of them royal, including Princess Juliana of the Netherlands, who would one day be queen, and 6-year-old Princess Elizabeth of York, the future Queen Elizabeth II. It was the first royal wedding to be broadcast on radio. Listeners across Britain and around the world heard the service, heard the vows, heard the music that included Mendelssohn's Wedding March and hymns carefully selected for the occasion. A second Greek Orthodox service followed later at the private chapel in Buckingham Palace. After the ceremony, George and Marina did something unprecedented. They stepped out onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace and waved to the crowd below, the first royal couple to do so after their wedding. The gesture seemed spontaneous, warm, modern, in a way that delighted the thousands gathered outside. The public fell in love with them instantly. Here was a couple that seemed to represent everything the monarchy could be. Glamorous, sophisticated, genuinely happy. Newspapers gushed about Marina's style, about George's good looks, about how perfectly matched they seemed. Behind closed doors, the reality was more complex. George had married for many reasons, but simple romantic love may not have been the primary one. Still, by all accounts, he cared for Marina deeply. They shared interests in music and the arts. They both appreciated beauty, culture, conversation. And Marina, worldly and sophisticated from her years in Paris, seems to have understood her husband in ways that mattered. She knew about his past. She almost certainly knew about his ongoing attractions to both men and women. Whether they had an explicit understanding about such matters, or simply an unspoken acceptance, no one outside their marriage could say. What's certain is that they created something together that worked, at least publicly. They settled into a home at 3 Belgrave Square in London, and George personally designed the interior decoration. He poured himself into the project, choosing everything from colour schemes to furniture to artwork. The result was stunning. Unlike any other royal residence in Britain, where Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle were museums of tradition, 3 Belgrave Square felt modern, alive, elegant, without being stuffy. The house became a gathering place for artists, musicians, writers, and theatrical people. Composers came to play their newest works. Painters discussed technique over dinner. It was everything the staid royal residences were not: lively, creative, modern, full of conversation and ideas. Marina fit perfectly into this world. She'd grown up in the artistic circles of Paris, understood that the life of the mind and the appreciation of beauty were as important as any royal duty. Together, she and George created a salon where culture flourished under royal patronage. They entertained constantly. Not the formal state dinners that George's parents hosted, with their rigid seating charts and endless protocol. These were gatherings where interesting people mixed, where conversation flowed naturally, where someone might play the piano at midnight or launch into a passionate debate about modern art. The public loved them for it. Here was a royal couple genuinely connected to the cultural life of the nation, not just patrons in name, but active participants. Newspapers wrote breathlessly about Marina's fashion choices, about the parties at Belgrave Square, about the glamorous life the Duke and Duchess of Kent were leading. On October 9th, 1935, Marina gave birth to their first child, a son named Edward. The birth of a male heir solidified George's position, gave him a clear purpose beyond simply being the fourth son. He was a father now, with responsibilities that went beyond himself. A daughter, Alexandra, followed on Christmas Day 1936. The timing seemed perfect. A royal birth on Christmas, a gift to the nation. The Duke and Duchess of Kent had become, in the eyes of the British public, the ideal royal couple with the ideal royal family. Photographs showed George with his children, smiling, relaxed, genuinely engaged. He seemed to understand that being a parent could be about more than just duty and discipline. The year everything changed. But 1936 would prove to be a year that changed everything, not just for George and Marina, but for the entire House of Windsor. In January, King George V died. George's eldest brother ascended the throne as King Edward VIII. But everyone who knew Edward knew that his relationship with Wallis Simpson was heading toward a crisis. She was American. She was divorced. She was everything a British queen could not be. By December, the crisis had arrived. Edward VIII announced his decision to abdicate, choosing marriage to Wallis over the crown. The throne passed to Albert, who became King George VI despite his horror at the prospect. For a brief moment, some people considered George and Marina as possible alternatives. George was confident where Albert was shy. Marina was every inch a queen, where Elizabeth, Albert's wife, had never expected to be anything more than a duchess. George and Marina had a male heir. They had the glamour, the presence, the apparent stability. But it was never a real possibility. The line of succession was clear, and Albert, however reluctantly, accepted his duty. George and Marina settled into supporting roles, which perhaps suited George better anyway. He had never wanted the weight of the crown. He wanted to live, to experience, to explore, wings and war. The late 1930s saw George pursuing the new passion that had captured his imagination: aviation. He earned his pilot's license in 1929, becoming one of the first members of the royal family to do so. The freedom of flight appealed to something deep in his nature. Up there, above the clouds, he wasn't a prince with duties and expectations. He was the first royal to cross the Atlantic Ocean by air. The journey was long and not without danger. But George loved it. Flying represented freedom, technology, the future, embracing something new and modern when his family preferred the tried and tested. In March 1937, he received a commission in the Royal Air Force as a group captain. He was made Honorary Air Commodore of the County of Kent Squadron. The appointment felt right in a way that his naval service never had. By June 1939, he'd been promoted to Air Vice Marshal, along with equivalent promotions in the Royal Navy and British Army. On paper, George now held senior rank in all three services. When war broke out in September 1939, George initially returned to the Royal Navy as a Rear Admiral, briefly serving in the Intelligence Division of the Admiralty. His language skills and his connections across Europe made him particularly useful for intelligence work. He could move in circles that ordinary officers couldn't access, could gather information in ways that weren't available to others. But by April 1940, he'd transferred to the Royal Air Force, where his real interests and passion truly lay. He took a staff position at RAF Training Command, deliberately accepting a lower rank so he wouldn't outrank more experienced and seasoned officers. It was a gesture that showed considerable maturity, an understanding that real military service required more than just wearing the uniform. The work was important, but unglamorous, and far from combat. Training Command was responsible for preparing pilots for combat, a vital function, but one that kept George well away from the fighting. He inspected facilities, reviewed training programs, met with instructors and cadets. It was desk work mostly, meetings and reports and endless bureaucracy. Later, from July 1941 onward, he served in the welfare section of the Inspector General's staff. The role suited him perfectly. He would visit RAF stations across Britain, talking to the men, boosting morale, being the face of royal support for the men in uniform. George was good at this. He had the charm, the ease with people, the genuine interest in hearing their stories. When he visited a base, it wasn't just a formal inspection. He'd sit in the mess with ordinary airmen, ask about their families, their worries, their hopes. He made them feel seen, valued, important. The visits took him all over Britain: remote bases in Scotland, training facilities in the Midlands, coastal stations watching for German aircraft. Everywhere he went, he left behind men who felt better for having met him, who felt that someone important cared about what they were doing. It was perhaps the most meaningful work he'd ever done, not because it was glamorous or exciting, but because it mattered. These were young men, many of them barely out of their teens, facing the possibility of death every time they climbed into a cockpit. A visit from the Duke of Kent, a conversation, a genuine expression of appreciation, these small things made a difference. On July 4th, 1942, Marina gave birth to their third child, another son, named Michael. George was delighted. His family was complete. His life seemed to have found a balance between duty and personal satisfaction. He attended Michael's christening in early August, his last official royal event. Photographs from that day show a man who looks content, at ease with himself in a way he hadn't always been. He'd found a balance between duty and personal satisfaction, between the obligations of royalty and the life he wanted to live. 7 weeks later, he was dead. The fatal flight. Sunday, August 25th, 1942. RAF Invergordon, a seaplane base on the Cromarty Firth in Scotland. The weather was miserable. Thick fog blanketed the area, the kind of weather that kept sensible people on the ground. But the flight to Iceland couldn't wait. George, in his role as a senior RAF welfare officer, was scheduled to inspect various RAF bases there. He would be accompanied by his private secretary, Lieutenant John Lowther, who had served George for 7 years. His air equerry, pilot officer Michael Strutt, would also be aboard. In total, 15 men would make the journey. The aircraft was a short Sunderland Mark III flying boat, designated W4026. It was a large, reliable aircraft, designed for long-range maritime patrol. The pilot, Flight Lieutenant Frank Goyen, was considered one of the best Sunderland pilots in the RAF. He'd flown numerous politicians and VIPs during the war. This should have been routine. At 1:05 p.m., the Sunderland lifted off from the water, climbing into the fog. The flight plan was straightforward. Follow the east coast of Scotland northward, staying over water until reaching the northernmost tip, then turn northwest toward Iceland. Simple navigation, the kind experienced pilots did routinely, but something went wrong. At 1:42 p.m., just 37 minutes after takeoff, the Sunderland was miles off course. Instead of being safely over the North Sea, it was flying inland, heading west over the remote highlands of Caithness. The aircraft was at about 650 feet, far too low for the terrain. Eagles Rock, a hillside near the small village of Dunbeath, rises to over 700 feet. The Sunderland, flying blind in the fog with its engines at full power, never saw it coming. The impact was catastrophic. The flying boat, carrying 2,500 gallons of fuel in its wings, exploded on contact. The sound echoed across the empty landscape. 14 of the 15 people aboard died instantly, their bodies scattered across the rocky hillside. The only survivor was Sergeant Andrew Jack, the rear gunner. He was thrown clear of the wreckage, badly injured, but alive. For 90 minutes, he lay there alone among the twisted metal and the dead, waiting for help that seemed like it would never come. Local people had heard the explosion. Dr. John Kennedy and 2 policemen, Will Bethune and James Sutherland, made their way to the remote crash site. What they found was carnage. The Duke of Kent was identified among the dead, his body having borne the full force of the impact. The aftermath. The news reached London that evening. King George VI, already bearing the unexpected weight of the crown, now had to absorb the death of his brother. Queen Mary, who had lost her husband just 6 years earlier, had now lost a son. Marina was at home with her 3 children, including 6-week-old Michael, who would never remember his father. At 35 years old, she was a widow. Her 3 children, Edward, Alexandra, and Michael, aged 6, 5, and 6 weeks, were fatherless. Winston Churchill made a statement in the House of Commons describing George as a gallant and handsome prince. Messages of condolence poured in from around the world. General Władysław Sikorski, head of the Polish government in exile, sent a special dispatch to all Polish troops in Britain, describing George as a proven friend of Poland. But even as the tributes flowed, questions were already beginning to surface. A court of inquiry opened on August 28th, 3 days after the crash. It completed its work on September 1st. The conclusion: pilot error. Flight Lieutenant Goyen had somehow allowed the aircraft to drift 15 degrees off course and had flown at too low an altitude for the terrain. It seemed straightforward enough, except it wasn't. Goyen was one of the most experienced Sunderland pilots in the RAF. The Sunderland had 4 experienced navigators aboard. The weather was poor, but not impossibly so. The flight plan that Goyen had filed before takeoff, which would have shown his intended route, disappeared. The papers of the secret court of inquiry also vanished. The wreckage was cleared from the crash site with unusual speed, completed by September 16th, just 3 weeks after the accident. The various deaths were recorded with the registrar in a disjointed, almost haphazard manner. George's personal diary and papers for this period could not be found. Most puzzling of all, why did Goyen fly west over land when his route should have kept him over water? It was a clear day once you got above the fog. An experienced pilot would have known immediately that something was wrong when he was flying over land instead of sea. Why didn't he correct course? Why did he descend to 650 feet when flying over highlands? The Sunderland Mark III had one significant flaw. It was sluggish when climbing, especially when heavily laden. Why would an expert pilot put himself in that position? And what was the special mission referenced on George's memorial? The inscription reads, "In memory of the Duke of Kent and his companions who lost their lives on active service during a flight to Iceland on a special mission on August 25th, 1942. The use of special mission is intriguing. Morale visits were routine duties. Why characterize this particular trip as special? Over the years, theories have proliferated. Some suggested sabotage, a Nazi plot to kill a member of the British royal family. Others pointed to George's rumoured peace sympathies, his alleged meetings with the German ambassador before the war, his supposed connection to Rudolf Hess's mysterious flight to Scotland in 1941. Some theorists noted that the Duke of Hamilton, who was involved in the Hess affair, had met with George multiple times in early 1941. They suggested that George might have been involved in unauthorized peace negotiations and that his death was arranged by the British government to silence him. There were whispers about why the funeral was held on August 29th, even while the court of inquiry was still in session. Why the rush? What were they trying to hide? But perhaps the simplest explanation is the truest. A pilot, even an experienced one, made a mistake. The weather was poor. The aircraft was heavily loaded. Goyen drifted off course, perhaps distracted, perhaps dealing with some minor technical issue. He realized his error too late. The Sunderland's poor climbing performance meant he couldn't gain altitude quickly enough. They hit the hillside at full power, probably because Goyen was desperately trying to climb. Accidents happen, even to skilled people, even to princes. The funeral. George's funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, on August 29th, 1942. Marina attended with Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary, all 3 women dressed in black, with heavy crepe veils covering their faces. King George VI and the Duke of Gloucester both wept openly during the service. Kings Haakon VII of Norway, George II of Greece, and Peter II of Yugoslavia attended, along with Crown Prince Olav of Norway and other European royalty. Queen Wilhelmina and Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands were there. It was a gathering of the royal families of Europe, many of them already in exile because of the war. come to mourn one of their own. As George's coffin was lowered into the royal vaults beneath the chapel, Marina almost collapsed. Queen Elizabeth supported her as she stood and watched her husband disappear from view, her lips moving in silent prayer. George was the first member of the British royal family to die on active military service in more than 400 years. The last had been Prince Maurice of Battenberg, killed in action in 1914 during World War I. But Maurice's death had been different, in combat, leading his men in battle at Ypres. George's death in a plane crash felt more arbitrary, more senseless, robbed of even the dignity of dying in direct service to his country. Sergeant Andrew Jack, the sole survivor, was visited several times by Marina after the crash. What he told her influenced what was inscribed on George's memorial, particularly that phrase, "special mission." But Jack never publicly revealed what the mission truly was, if indeed it was anything beyond a routine morale visit. In August 1968, 26 years to the day before Marina's own funeral, George's body was transferred from the vaults of St. George's Chapel to the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, where Marina would join him the following day. The legacy. What remains of Prince George, Duke of Kent, is a complicated legacy. He was the most interesting member of his generation of royals, perhaps because he was the least constrained by duty. Born far enough from the throne to have some freedom, he used that freedom to explore, to experience, to live in ways his brothers never could. His struggles with addiction were real and serious. The stories about Kiki Preston and the silver syringe weren't exaggerations. George fell into that world deeply enough that it nearly destroyed him. That he managed to pull himself out, with his brother's help, speaks to a resilience that might surprise those who only see the surface glamour. His sexuality remains a matter of historical debate, not because the evidence isn't there, it is, but because in 1940s Britain, such things were never acknowledged openly. Whether George had relationships with men like Noel Coward or Anthony Blunt, whether the rumours about Michael Temple Canfield being his illegitimate son with Kiki Preston were true, we may never know with certainty. What we do know is that his marriage to Marina seemed to work on its own terms. They created a home together that was genuinely cultured and artistic. They raised 3 children who all went on to serve the royal family with distinction. Marina remained devoted to George's memory for the rest of her life, never remarrying despite her youth when she was widowed. George's contribution to British aviation and his service during World War II, often overlooked in the more sensational stories about his personal life, were genuine. He took his military duties seriously, even if they came late in his life. He understood the importance of morale, of showing up, of being present for the men in uniform who looked to the royal family for inspiration. The crash that killed him robbed Britain of a prince who had finally found his purpose. At 39, George had survived his wild years, had proven he could be more than just the spare's spare. He had become a husband, a father, a serving officer. Whatever his flaws, and they were many, he had shown it was possible to be both royal and human, to struggle and fail, and ultimately succeed in finding meaning. The mystery of what happened on August 25th, 1942, continues to fascinate precisely because George himself was fascinating. The questions about the crash, the missing documents, the unclear circumstances, all of it feeds into our desire to believe there was more to the story. Maybe there was. Maybe it was just fog and pilot error and terrible luck. Either way, Prince George, Duke of Kent, lived too fast and died too young, leaving behind a beautiful widow, 3 small children, and a series of questions that may never be fully answered. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.